It's nice to be back on this campus. Dr. Cooper, dear Afua, your words of introduction go straight to my heart. I received them with great emotion, and in no small part because I have such immense respect for you, for the critical, scholarly, and collaborative work you spearhead, and the power of your voice, the power of her voice, through art and poetry, among other forms of expression. You are a towering figure in the field of Black Canadians' history, one of our foremost Canadian scholars whose work I have read, appreciated, and admired for a long time. Of course, chief among them, the hanging of Angélique, the untold story of Canadian slavery, and the burning of Old Montreal. And you work as chair of the Lord Dalhousie Scholarly Panel on Slavery and Race, a model that should be emulated by many Canadian institutions. More than a long-time fan, consider me a devoted distance student of yours. So thank you. Thanks also for inviting me. And since we're both from the Caribbean, merci en pile. That's in Haitian Creole. Merci en pile. Dear Afua, you have said that focusing on Black history is key to getting more Black students involved in the fields of science, technology, engineering, and math, STEM for short. I believe the same. The power of history is that it can inform and inflect personal trajectories. In knowing what came before us, what our foremothers and forefathers faced, confronted, and yes, also overcame, there is tremendous power. Adversity is fire. As such, it can harden the steel of our resolve to conquer and defeat prejudices, injustice, violence, and hate. Knowing what came before us is an antidote to oppression. It explains our current predicaments, the courage it took our forebears, and how freedom was won. Looking the evil of past abuse in the eye, we face squarely the root cause of the problem and the need to eradicate it. As you know, we all understand we are here because of the resistance of our mothers and fathers and their mothers and fathers before them. That's why we're here. The mere fact that we are standing in this moment, a free people, and I know that. Every time I stand and speak, I appreciate the freedom that I feel and the energy of that freedom that comes from a long struggle. And in this moment, being a free person, for all of us being a free people, we know that it took a miracle of inner strength and collective willpower. Now, aren't we here to make sure that our children and our children's children don't face the indignity, abuse, and brutality that still exist today? Isn't that a radical program of change we are here to implement, my dear friends? We need to be convinced of that. Which brings us to today's goal. We want to shift and transform, for example, school curricula so that new generations push even harder, even further, until no more prejudices, no more injustice, violence, and hate can stand in our way. This conference of action and possibilities, as you call it, couldn't come at a more opportune time, right on the eve of the third edition of the National Black Canadians Summit, which, as you know, starts this Friday, right here in Halifax, as a cross-Canada and international springboard for launching the Halifax Declaration for the Eradication of Systemic Racism. Sold out. We'll have over 1,300 people coming here to Halifax for the conference, and hundreds of people also participating online. And that declaration is important, and that's why I made sure that a delegation from the United Nations be here to give it a global resonance. Because what's special about this Canadian initiative is that it comes bottom up. What we want is a strategic plan of action for the eradication of systemic racial discrimination in our country. That's what we want. And I can't help but notice how timely, nearly synchronous, these two events are. What a busy week, let's say, for Black emancipation. Just the same, I can't help but notice how timely, nearly synchronous, the historical apologies delivered 2 weeks ago by the head of the Canadian government to the No. 2 Construction Battalion, and those being expressed today to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples by the head of the Catholic Church. Canada appears to finally, starting to reckon with the violence of its colonial past. It's important. As Natasha Henry, president of the Ontario Black History Society, has pointed out, to date, Canada has rightfully issued several apologies, some accompanied by compensation, in recognition of past wrongs and mistreatment of several groups. Japanese Canadians received an apology in 1988 for internment during the Second World War. The federal government apologized to Chinese Canadians for the Chinese head tax in 2006. Parliament has apologized to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people for residential schools, first in 2008 and again 2017 to include Newfoundland pre-1949. More action is needed to address the power engines that run these systems. The federal government has also acknowledged the internment of Ukrainian Canadians and Canadians from Eastern Europe during the First World War in 2008, and in 2016 issued an apology to Sikh Canadians for turning away the Komagata Maru in 1914. A more recent apology occurred in 2017 when Prime Minister Justin Trudeau delivered an apology to LGBTQ Canadian civil servants and members of the military for decades of state-sponsored systemic oppression and rejection. It is also worth noting that Queen Elizabeth II apologized for the Acadian expulsion in 2003, a pre-Confederation wrong, but was careful to include a disclaimer bearing legal and financial liability. Well, yet one group is conspicuous by its absence. Allow me to quote you, dear Afua. While other groups have received apologies for acts of discrimination and racism, no such gesture has been forthcoming to Black communities in Canada. It's almost like people don't want to apologize to Black people. End of quote. It is hard to argue with that assertion, Dr. Cooper. As an example of how the accomplishments of Black people are often overlooked, especially in scientific fields, you suggested, dear Afua, that I look into the life of Dr. Clement Ligure. I'm glad I did because I learned a lot. We keep learning. For our distinguished guest, let me summarize what I learned, because I was astonished by what I found. An unsung hero of the 1917 Halifax explosion, the co-founder of the No. 2 Construction Battalion, and a graduate from a Canadian university that expelled and then barred Black medical students. Dr. Clement Courtney Ligure was originally from Trinidad and came to Canada to study medicine at Queen's University in Ontario. Did you know that in 1918, the Queen's Faculty of Medicine implemented a ban on the admittance of Black students, barring Black people from future enrollment for nearly 40 years? Medical schools at McGill, the University of Toronto, and Dalhousie also openly excluded and discriminated against Black students and applicants for years, by the way. That injustice is all the more ironic that one of Queen's most important early benefactors, Robert Sutherland, the first student of graduate of color at Queen's University, and with honors in classics and mathematics no less, who also became British North America's first known Black lawyer, is credited with saving Queen's from being annexed by the University of Toronto through the gift of his whole estate in 1878. You rise, beyond prejudices. That's what you do. My mother taught me that. Barely escaping the ban from Queen's, Ligure moved to Halifax 2 years after graduating, becoming the first Black physician in Nova Scotia. As a Black man, Dr. Ligure was denied hospital privileges and thus had to establish a private surgical practice in his own home, which he called the Amanda Hospital on North Street, in a house that is still standing and remains the focus of preservation efforts. His practice was the most prominent medical facility for people in Halifax North End. In the First World War, the Canadian military allowed arbitrary discrimination by commanders against enlisted troops. This meant there was a widespread refusal to allow Black men to enlist. As a result, hundreds of Black men in Canada were turned away when they volunteered to fight in 1914 because they weren't wanted in what was considered a white man's war. It took 2 years of protests, but the Canadian military finally received approval in 1916 to establish a segregated non-combat battalion. And this is how Dr. Ligure, along with Reverend William White and J.R.B. Whitney, co-founded the No. 2 Construction Battalion, thus formed a segregated unit. No. 2 Construction Battalion became Canada's first and only all-Black military regiment, only allowed to serve in a non-combat role overseas. Ligure was slated to become the battalion's chief medical officer, but because the military would have had to make him an officer an unthinkable thing at the time, he was passed over for a white man, Captain Dan Murray, grandfather to Nova Scotia senior Anne Murray. Adding insult to injury, when it became to his own enlistment, Liguori failed his physical exam to join the battalion by just 1 point. Nevertheless, Liguori went on to help recruit members. More than 300 of those who enlisted were from Nova Scotia. So the battalion was repeatedly told its help wasn't wanted on the front lines, and they received no public recognition when they returned home. But 2 weeks ago, 106 years after the formation of the historic battalion that faced such overt racism and systemic discrimination during the First World War, the Prime Minister of Canada and the Minister of National Defense both apologized on behalf of the Canadian government to descendants and relatives of the men of the No. 2 Construction Battalion gathered in Truro. May I say, and let's not forget, that the recognition and apology is a result of major historical research efforts and persistent advocacy by members of Black communities in Nova Scotia and across Canada. So hooray to these efforts. But Clement Liguori did not receive credit for helping found the No. 2 Construction Battalion in 1916. Months later, on December 6, 1917, the largest man-made explosion occurred when the SS Mont Blanc drifted in the Halifax harbor after collision carrying 2,653 tons of explosives. Through his small hospital and countless home visits, Dr. Liguori worked around the clock for weeks to treat some of the over 9,000 injured people, saving hundreds of lives at no charge. Rise above. For weeks, his only assistant was H.D. Nicholas, a Pullman porter with no medical training, who boarded with him. Until his early death in 1922, Courtney Liguori lived a life of service that also included acting as the publisher of the Atlantic Advocate, the first newspaper for African Canadians, when founding publisher W.A. de Costa left Halifax to join the war effort as a member of the No. 2 Battalion, Construction Battalion. So this is Dr. Clement Courtney Liguori, one of the many unsung heroes who resisted racism first by their perseverance in acquiring science-based knowledge and then putting it to serve the community at large. Through merit and excellence, they broke through the walls of hate and showed the great valor of their humanity. I wish I had more time to talk about other impressive characters of Black resistance and accomplishment in STEM, including contemporary ones, of which there are so many, so many. I would have loved to tell you also about some high-profile Haitian STEM heroes in Quebec. A long list, including Haitian professors like Georges Anglade, one of the founders of the Université du Québec in Montreal, Samuel Pierre, professor of computer and engineering and artificial intelligence at Polytechnique, Chenet Pierre, Hydro-Québec, and their contributions educating thousands in scientific fields in the province. I could have talked about Gabi Gentil, pharmacist, doctors such as Dr. Yvette Bonny, first marrow transplant Dr. Gérard Blanchard, first hip transplant and separation of Siamese twins. Dr. Jean-Claude Fouron, founder of the fetal cardiology unit at Saint-Justine Hospital in Montreal. Dr. Nicolas Demers-Labrousse and Dr. Lacrouse, professors of the Faculty of Medicine of the University of Sherbrooke. Dr. Dominique Gattreau and Dr. Serge Rousseau, renowned gynecologists and obstetricians. Dr. Antoine Gattreau, endocrinologist, and many others from the Association of Les Médecins Haïtiens in Montreal. Dr. Louis E. Roy, donc Louis E. Roy plutôt en français, co-founder of the first service and treatment program of tuberculosis in Quebec, and who is also known as one of the fathers of the Haitian Constitution after the fall of the Duvalier regime in Haiti. So many of them. So many of them. The list of Haitian exiles and refugees who have contributed to the modernization, the professionalization, and the development of innovative practices in all fields of medicine and STEM fields in Quebec is long and absolutely impressive. As well, I would have loved to tell you more about indigenous heroes in STEM, including Dr. James McCaucus from the Saddle Lake Cree Nation in northern Alberta, who leads one of North America's most progressive family medical clinics serving both LGBTQ2+ and First Nation peoples from all over Canada. So thankfully, you need not look very far for many more role models, and especially right here in Dalhousie. So I encourage you to go see the African Canadians in Science, Technology, and Innovation exhibition by Emo Taps. Yes, here, Legacy Academy, right? ELA.
Yes.
ELA. Okay, that's great. Really showcasing, right, the contribution of Black people to STEM throughout history, starting with the ancient Egyptians and ending with contemporary scientists, inventors, and engineers. I like to say to the students at the African Development University based in Niamey, Niger, that Niger is really where the studies on la géothermie. Comment est-ce qu'on dit ça, géothermie? Yes, yes. The first studies in geothermists were done in Niger, Africa. Yeah. You say Niger or Niger? Niger. Niger, next to Nigeria, Niger. So I heard the founder of the African Development University, when I met him, they're all young alumni, who founded that university, very innovative, and the idea is really to make sure that from an African perspective, they can really reinforce competences and capacities to address the needs of the African continent and really building on new technologies. And I heard him speak about Niger and saying, well, it's one of the poorest countries in the world. And so I called him, I said, Kader, talk about the richness of this country. What this country has given in terms of sciences, knowledge, science knowledge to the world. With these studies on géothermie. Je sais davantage le mot en français, géothermie. Mais c'est important. En ce moment, avec le réchauffement climatique, on fait beaucoup d'études sur la géothermie. Vous vous rendez compte? Et eux, déjà, depuis longtemps, se sont vraiment concentrés sur ce domaine. I think the achievements look all the more impressive when we know the huge barriers that were faced. Did you know, for instance, that the practice of segregated and unequal schooling lasted well into the later part of the 20th century in Canada? Sometimes we Canadians live like in a bubble of innocence, right? Oh, us, no, not us. We need to look, to concentrate and look at, the wrongs of the past in order, to build the present. Otherwise, the future takes its revenge. So in Nova Scotia in particular, blacks had to use separate entrances, exits, and washrooms throughout the 1950s and 1960s. The Mary E. Cornish School in Lincolnville, Guysborough County, Nova Scotia, was the last segregated school in Canada. It closed its doors only in 1983. So no surprise then that 40 years later, in 2022, black students continue to be marginalized and treated like they don't belong in certain fields of study. Today, systemic racism remains an urgent matter to discuss and eliminate throughout the education systems of Canada. A new generation of bright young minds continues to be disproportionately streamed into education tracks away from university education as a result of systemic factors and individual prejudice, including racial stereotyping. My own daughter, Eden, was told point blank by a university guidance counselor that, and she quoted that counselor who said to her, people like you don't belong in this field of higher education. It had a detrimental impact on her motivation, I must say, still today. And of course, she remains very angry against the institution. It will take her some time, I'm sure, to recover from this. She answered back, though, about people like you. She wrote back to that counselor, showed me her answer, and it was impressive. So at least there's something very solid. She's on solid foundation. But gee, it was a shock for her. So how come so few black youth feel supported by their teachers in their quest for knowledge, as shown by various studies? This is especially disturbing because we know the vital importance of teacher support as a key factor in students' overall engagement. How is it that for too many black students, schools become, unfortunately, oppressive environments where they experience disparaging, disheartening, and discouraging comments, like my daughter, including from their teachers, along with the harm of cultural erasure and psychological violence? Gee, this is an emergency. It needs to be addressed. For education is about opening wings, creating free minds, developing self-aware, critical spirits that engage fully with the world. My grandmother used to say to me, education is the key to freedom, because then you have more choices. Systemic barriers stand in shameful betrayal of the very purpose of education. Dismantling systemic racism is the most urgent and necessary task. We are all bound together by a shared history that has poisoned our past and still shapes our present. That fact is inescapable. We are also entwined by shared experiences that have connected us, by successful struggles that have shaped and built our communities, and that's where the hope lies. Again, Dr. Harvey, hope. So here we are, standing on the shores of Chibuktuk, or Great Harbor, as the Mi'kmaq called Halifax. We're in the same boat, undeniably. We can't see very far into the future, but a long view of the past is possible, and it's called memory. And that is why, in that boat, we row forward, looking back. Facing history helps us steer clear and old wanderings and errancies, while a glance above the shoulders allows us to stay the course, rowing together. So let us move resolutely and in solidarity towards the new Canada that we want, the one being built through our very actions today. I'll see many of you again, I know, this Friday at the 3rd edition of the National Black Indian Summit to plan next steps, building towards the most powerful Emancipation Day this country has ever seen. For those of you not yet registered, this invitation is to join us online. So I thank you very mich. I say, Wilaline, du fond du cœur, je vous remercie. Merci en pile. Merci beaucoup.